Yeah, hello and welcome to our lecture series on climate protection. First, I would like to show you the page of the Campus Kino. I think most of you are familiar with this page. It's Campus Kino is existing since the 350th anniversary of University of Innsbruck, and there are always interesting movies. So what's interesting for our lecture is the movie in 14 days. So it's this one about Sparknum. You already have seen the teaser, and we will have Christina Biasi for the introduction. Then we will see this short movie, and and the artist Caroline Witztum from UK will also speak about her work. Yeah, and now let's begin with our lecture.
Welcome also from my side to the climate protection, to the lecture series, Climate Protection. Today we are looking at the topic, the so-called New Green Deal, or perhaps No Deal. We will hear from Patrick Abel. Thank you that you are here. Because climate protection is not just a matter of policy, but increasingly a high matter of law. Our guest today, Patrick Abel, is an expert at this very intersection. As an assistant professor at the Institute of European and International Law here at the University of Innsbruck, he researches and teaches the legal framework of global climate policy. His expertise is highly sought after in the field. He regularly advises both public and private institutions, including the German federal government, whom he supported via the science platform Climate Protection in developing their long-term climate strategy. Patrick, we are very looking forward to your insights. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much to the conveners of this lecture series for having me. It's a true pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to spending the next 19 minutes with you, presenting you something about the European Green Deal and EU law, and also, of course, to enter into discussions with you on this topic. And when we thought about this lecture, we came to well, I would say provocative question for you that will form the starting point of this lecture. And this question is, what does the de facto end of the European Green Deal mean for climate protection? And of course, I know that most of you have no legal training. And so my goal today is to introduce you into the law of the European Green Deal, to discuss what we have achieved, and to give you an understanding of how things are changing currently, okay? And then it will be up to you to answer this question, okay? And maybe to us in the discussion to reflect on whether we are at the end of the European Green Deal or whether we could maybe also see it as a new start. And so when we look into the legal side of things related to climate protection, the European Green Deal is a very prominent notion in the sense that it is a flagship political program of the European Commission. But very importantly, and to start things, it is not a single law. So European Green Deal is a notion to describe a political program launched by the European Commission in December 2019. In fact, it was the main political project of the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, at this time. So planned as a comprehensive package of then dozens of legislative acts tied together by one overarching goal: climate neutrality by 2050. So think back to 2019. a very different time, no war in Europe, a very strong political movement, especially by young people, um, pushing for more climate protection, generally a political climate that was favorable to climate change mitigation. And in these political dynamics, we find this flagship political program of Ursula von der Leyen in 2019 to push things forward, to strive for climate neutrality by 2050, or as the President von der Leyen used to say, that Europe should be the first continent in the world to achieve climate neutrality. Right? And so with climate neutrality, we mean that emissions and the capacity to take emissions from the atmosphere and emissions reduction result in a net zero emissions of greenhouse gases. And the idea was to translate this political project of 2050 climate neutrality into EU law, into something hard, into something that you can use, and that is not only left to the political process and to discussions, but into hard law. And then the first instrument that I would like to introduce you to is the so-called European climate law. And this is where the first part of this talk starts to tell you what we actually have in the European Green Deal today. The European climate law is a law that was made and entered into effect in 2021, so already 5 years old. And it makes climate targets legally binding. And I hope that you can see it on the slide here very easily. This is actually from the Commission and the EU Climate Action Progress Report from 2025, where you can see the targets that the EU has set for itself. We have the target of 55% emission reductions by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. We always also had in this 2021 regulation, well, this goal of climate neutrality by 2050. That was the innovation in 2021 to put it into a law. And then now, very recently, there was a new goal introduced for 2040, about which I will speak in more detail in a minute, which generally introduces a goal of 90% emissions reductions by 2040, with important caveats that I will address in a minute. But that's what the European climate law is all about, to setting general targets for emission reductions, so that these are not only political targets, but also legal targets. And in this sense, it is a framework, okay? It doesn't specify any means that the EU has to take or the member states has to take. So it's not about prohibiting things. It's not about emissions trading or so. It doesn't specify any instruments. It's just setting targets. But that's an important starting point for any law, to define certain targets so that we know what we have to aim for when we actually looking into the instruments, legal instruments at our disposal. And so based on this, I would like to answer 3 questions today. What has the EU achieved in climate protection so far based on this European climate law that I just introduced to you? Then secondly, what type of legal setbacks have we witnessed recently? And this is where the provocative question from the beginning comes from. Okay, we have legal setbacks. Spoiler alert. And then the third question, what does the future hold? Looking into the future, and perhaps also as a basis for our discussion, where does all this lead? And of course, this is a legal lecture, right? So my idea would be to tell you something about the law, but I, of course, do not require any prior legal knowledge. So let's start with what has the EU achieved so far, right? And the big picture is as follows. The EU net greenhouse gas emissions fell by over 37% since 1990. So these are data that refer to either to 2023 or 2024, sometimes 2025 as references. Here on the right, you see a figure for the time period of 28 to 2024, where you can see the yearly emissions reductions to the previous years. And you can see, well, it's going down, right? And there is one very big success story that the Commission is never tires to explain, which is the decoupling of economic growth from emissions. Okay, the GDP since 1990 grew by approximately 70%, while at the same time greenhouse gas emissions fell by over 37%. So this shows as a success story that generally it is possible to achieve economic growth while also reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And especially one instrument was very successful in doing so, and that is one instrument that I will explain in a few minutes, which is the emissions trading system that covers the power and the industry sectors. And here we can even see approximately 50% greenhouse gas reductions since 2005. And I think that is really something we can call a success story. And I think it's useful to remind ourselves that we have actually achieved something here. And the problem, however, is when we look into the future and into the 2030 goal, so the one that is the first goal set in the European climate law, on the basis of March of last year, the data shows that if we keep the existing measures as they are, we will not achieve the target of minus 55%. Rather, we will only achieve around 47% emissions reductions, so 8% missing. And this is with the existing measures. So all measures that the member states take, Austria, Germany, Spain, and so on and so forth. If we consider everything that is planned, so all measures that member states have told us that they wish to take in the future until 2030, even then the projections show that we will not be able to meet the minus 55% goal. There would be still 1% missing. Okay, we're coming close, right? That's great. But even if everything enters into reality, comes into reality that we're planning, we would not achieve our goals for 2030. And of course, I guess we are all realists, right? If everything comes to reality that is planned, that would be surprising, to say the least. Okay, so we have a gap. We have already an ambitions gap for the first target of 2030, right? So we have achieved a lot, but already looking into what is projected, there is already some ambition missing. And let's go to this slide. And don't worry, I will go through this slide step by step, because I would like to show you a part of the legal picture here. So what are we actually doing? What are we planning to do in law to achieve the 2030, 2040, 2050 targets? And this is where things get interesting. And I'm sure that now entering into these instruments in some detail will be of use to you. Okay, so there are two major pillars in EU law that we need to distinguish. And if there is one thing that you take away from this lecture, it should be this one, okay? Two major pillars. On the left, the EU ETS system. So the EU ETS is an abbreviation for emissions trading system. That's the first legal pillar. And then below, the effort sharing regulation is the second big legal pillar. Okay, these are the two main boxes in EU law for climate protection. And emissions trading system is the one that I described a few minutes ago as the one that was very successful. Okay, and the two pillars are covering different sectors in society and economy. Okay, so the emissions trading system covers the power sector, the heavy industry, so for example, production of steel, production of cement, aviation within the EU. So if you take a plane from Vienna to Madrid, and the maritime sector, so maritime transport, shipping. These 4 sectors are covered by the EU emissions trading system. And these are very crucial sectors, especially the power sector. So how we produce energy, how we produce electricity. Think about coal mines, right? Think about gas, where we have fossil fuels, right? The production of this energy, the power sector, is covered by the ETS, and heavy industry, of course, is also a major polluter when we think about the emissions that are created when we, for example, produce steel, one of the most traditional industry sectors in Europe. Actually, one that of the foundation stones, right? When you think about the beginnings of the EU, it was with coal and steel, right, where the European integration started. And now it's a problematic industry for climate protection. And now this emissions trading system is very powerful because it has a market-based system that, in a way, we could say automatically reduces emissions. And how does this work? Well, there are 2 things you need to understand here. First, there is a cap, and secondly, there is a trade aspect. Let's start with the cap aspect. Capping emissions means that this law sets a maximum volume of emissions that can happen within a year. It's a number, basically. It's giving you a number of the maximum volume of greenhouse gases that are allowed to be emitted by these covered sectors within a year. So let's take an example. Let's just say, to make things easy, that we have 100 gigatons of greenhouse gases as a maximum for 2026. This means, well, you count the emissions from all power installations, all heavy industry, aviation in the EU, and the maritime sector. You count all of these emissions, and once they reach the cap, there is a strict prohibition that you may not emit any more in this year. Okay? So it guarantees that there is a maximum volume of greenhouse gas emissions by these sectors per year. And this makes it easier for politics to calculate, where we stand and where we want to go. Because you can say, well, okay, let's take 100 gigatons for 2026. But next year, 2027, we will reduce the cap and we will say, well, next year it's only 90 gigatons. And then it will be 80 gigatons in 2028, 70 gigatons in 2030, and so on and so forth, until you reach the 0 gigatons, perhaps in 2050. And here is the law has a very important role, because to emphasize this is a strict prohibition. You cannot go beyond. If you do so without having any legal allowance, you face a serious punishment, okay, up to criminal liability in certain cases, but at least severe financial repercussions as a business. And so there are, of course, government agencies that are in place in all the member states that will check this and will come to your company and check if everything is in order. And you as a company that is, for example, producing coal energy, maybe there's somebody here who owns a company that produces coal energy. I don't think so. But if you did, you would be under this obligation to, firstly, measure how much emissions you produce every year. And then secondly, to report this to the authorities. And if there is a problem, you face severe sanctions. Okay? That is the cap. And now to the trade aspect. Let's go back to my example, 100 gigatons as a maximum for 2026. How does this now work? Basically, you take this abstract number of 100 gigatons and you break it down into certificates that you can buy basically at a digital exchange platform. Right? It's all digitalized. It's a market platform. And here, these emissions allowances, or certificates as they are called, they are being auctioned. So there is an auction where these certificates are sold to the highest bidders. Okay? So you make your bidding, and then you try to buy these allowances, and each allowance is like basically a legal permission to emit a certain volume of greenhouse gases. So if you combine all of these allowances that circulate in a year, it will be the sum of the cap. Okay, so 100 gigatons broken down in lots of small allowances. For example, let's say I'm producing coal energy. I want to produce coal energy that leads to 10 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions in 2026. So I now need to go to this auction platform and buy certificates that basically mirror the 10 gigatons that I need. And this means that these 10 gigatons will then be taken out of the market. And so others cannot buy these 10 gigatons anymore. There are 90 remaining. So these auctions take place until all allowances are sold. And then you need to show this allowance, which is a legal permission for emitting greenhouse gases to the authorities. But you can do more. You can also buy a certificate at one point and then later sell it to another company. Imagine that at the beginning of 2026, you buy these certificates and then you suddenly encourage your engineers to develop a technology that makes your coal energy production more efficient. So you produce the same coal energy, but you, let's say, only emit 9 gigatons instead of 10 gigatons of greenhouse gases. Now suddenly you have bought already for emission certificates for 10 gigatons. You have 1 gigaton certificates too many. You can sell these certificates to your competitors that, for example, have bought too few certificates, have caused higher emissions, are maybe not engaging in such green technology innovation as you, need more certificates, so you can sell them to them. And so this is a trade system where suddenly those companies will have a benefit that innovate and become more efficient and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions because they will have certificates to spare that they can sell to others. Okay? Remember, you need the certificates, otherwise you need to stop your facility from emitting. And so overall, economists say that this emissions trading system has the very beneficial effect that it will lead to emissions reductions where this is cheapest to do. So it's a way of reducing emissions in an efficient way by making use of a market-based system that is coupled with a strict prohibition, the cap, right? So we have a combination of a prohibition and a market-based system below the cap. Okay, and that is a very elegant and actually very successful way of reducing emissions, and where the European Green Deal has done a lot to make this system very efficient. Remember, I told you the emissions trading system is the first pillar, right? Let's go to the second pillar, which is below the emissions trading system here, and which is called the effort sharing regulation. And it's a law that applies to all sectors that are excluded from the emissions trading system. And which sectors are these? Well, it's land transport. So when you and we drive our cars, that's part of the effort sharing regulation, but also buildings, so emissions caused by heating in private homes, for example, agriculture, small industries, because the ETS only covers heavy industry, and waste. These sectors are not subject to an European emissions trading system. Instead, the effort sharing regulation sets nationally binding emission targets for the member states. So because there is no uniform trading platform, instead what this regulation does is that it simply says, okay, Austria, you need to reduce your emissions in these covered sectors by X% until then. So The European climate law defines targets for all Europe, for all the EU. And now the effort sharing regulation translates these European targets into national targets for these sectors. Because the idea is that not every member state should have to provide that much effort as the others. So there's a different way of distributing the burdens that come with climate protection. So we have some member states that have weaker economies, have a lower state of development, and they do not have to do as much for climate protection as the richer member states have to do. So it's an idea of solidarity, that those also that have historically contributed more to emissions need to take the lead within the European Union. For example, countries such as Germany have rather strict national binding targets, whereas countries like, for example, Bulgaria or Romania do not even have to reduce their emissions, actually, right? There are certain member states, I'm not exactly sure which ones, but there are member states that do not need to reduce emissions in these sectors, because we say, look, this is for the richer member states to do. Problem is that this effort sharing relation only sets targets without also offering any instruments to reach these targets. Okay, this is for the member states to do in their domestic laws. So it would be for Austria to implement Austrian law in these sectors, or for Germany, and so on and so forth. The only thing the effort sharing regulation does is that it offers a monitoring and naming and shaming system. So member states regularly have to report on their progress for these nationally binding targets. Then the Commission will look into this. There will be discussions. There will be maybe suggestions what these member states could change, but nothing more. And compare this to the emissions trading system, where I've told you about a strict prohibition with penalties, right? Where the authorities are actually checking what companies do. And this is not existing in the field of the effort sharing regulation, where it's more about defining targets and leaving measures to the member states. And of course, we have huge differences between the member states. Let's take land transport sector. So cars, right? Think about Germany. Maybe you know that Germans are very enthusiastic about driving cars, right? And to put it mildly, it's not a huge success story, the German climate protection efforts and the land transport sector, okay? Then what we also have, so these are the main two pillars, okay? The big laws that cover all of these sectors, emissions trading or effort sharing. And then we also have more specific instruments for some detailed problems, let's say, or for certain technologies, for certain specific problems. For example, we have a regulation on land use change, and forestry, which defines targets and programs for land use. For example, we just talked actually about carbon sinks, natural carbon sinks before the lecture. So all of these natural ways of using biodiversity and ecology, let's say more broadly speaking, to reduce emissions or to prevent more emissions from happening, there you have a targeted regulation. And also, for example, we have a targeted regulation for heating efficiency in buildings. So there's an EU regulation on that. We also have a regulation on combustion engine cars, which I will discuss in more detail in a minute. But I want you to understand that these are more isolated, targeted, specific laws that are not embedded in a broader legal system as we can see it for the emissions trading system, right? The emissions trading system works EU-wide. It, combines different sectors like power, heavy industry, aviation, and it is market-based. So it's based on offer and demand. There is no one saying, look, you need to do this and that. Whereas, for example, the regulation on combustion engines would be a way of actually specifically regulating a certain type of technology, combustion engine cars, which is a totally different regulatory strategy. And the problem is always, how do we make these very different approaches consistent? How can we make sure, for example, that the emissions trading system works well together with additional laws that target specific technologies? And this is a very complex picture. And my idea now was to show you the two main pillars and to tell you, well, there is more specific laws there, and to talk about the fossil fuel engines in a minute. In addition to these sector laws, we also have more broadly the corporate sphere, where it's about the responsibility of companies, of all companies actually, to behave responsibly, which should arguably include climate responsible behavior. And here we have also had very important legal initiatives in the last years that you can see on the right side of the slide. And three examples very briefly, just to give you an overview or a sense of what we have. We have the so-called Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, very difficult word. It's about making the climate impact of companies transparent. So what happens is that large companies under this law now for the first time have the obligation to report on the sustainability impact of their activities. Okay? So they actually need to employ people that will check and measure how the corporation's activities impact human rights, but also the climate and the environment. They need to make a strategy. Okay, what are the targets now for the future in terms of climate protection? But this is only about reporting. Okay, it's about making things transparent. Everyone can download these reports online. And so, for example, the idea is that if a bank considers whether to invest into a company, it can check the reports to understand the sustainability impact that this company has, and then accordingly decide if they want to grant for example, a credit or not. Then below the CSDDD, it's the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, another fantastic, easy word, which is about supply chains. And this is another area of concern also for climate protection. The concern is that companies try to circumvent and escape EU climate laws by simply, bringing their production abroad, escaping the laws here, and doing everything abroad, right? And then, but bringing back the profits to the EU. In the context of climate protection, we call this carbon leakage also, which means that companies facing stricter EU climate laws will simply relocate, build their facilities in a non-EU country with weaker laws, and then simply import all of these products into the EU. So in the end, we would lose our industries, and this climate would still suffer the same emissions. And now one of the approaches that we have here, there are actually many, actually the two below, both are related to climate, to carbon leakage. So due diligence means that EU companies that have a seat in the EU, that they have a certain legal responsibility for violations that take place outside of the EU in the supply chain. So supply chains are all ways in which a company buys products, right? So maybe already the raw materials that at some point are being gathered or harvested, then they're being produced into certain products, then these products will first perhaps be combined, and then this product only comes to the company, to the EU. So this is a supply chain, right? And these supply chains in the globalized world are very complex. And the idea of this directive is EU companies must take responsibility if environmental damage happens in the supply chain. And if, of course, they know about this and haven't done anything against it. So the idea is that an EU company must check what suppliers are doing outside of the EU. Otherwise, they will face, for example, liability here. So damages, they need to pay damages. And this also includes the environmental protection and climate responsibility, generally speaking. Another initiative was and is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which basically wants to achieve that when you import a product from abroad, you're being treated in the same way as if you were subject to the EU emissions trading system. So imagine you produce steel in the EU. So now you're subject to the EU ETS. You need to buy emission certificates, right? As I told you 10 minutes ago. So now you could escape the ETS by relocating your steel factory to another country, let's say to the US, produce the steel there, and then export the steel into the EU. That would be cheaper because you would not be subject to the EU ETS. You're not in the EU as a producer, you're producing abroad. Now the carbon border adjustment mechanism does the following. When you import goods into the EU, you need to pay a tax, let's say, at the border that equals the amount of money you would have had to pay if you had produced this product in the EU. So that you have a level playing field. It doesn't matter if you produced abroad and imported the product or if you produced it in the EU in the first place, you always have to pay money, right? And this money depends on the emissions that you produced. So to prevent carbon leakage, CBAM is basically complementing the EU ETS system. Once again, I just want to give you a general idea of the complexity of this puzzle, right, that we have in EU law on climate protection and how they basically, or the interplay between these laws happen, illustrated by these instruments, okay? And where is now, what are the main areas where progress is stalling? Not all sectors are working well, especially road transport. So driving cars, the emissions increased even by 1% in 2024, which is the largest sector in the effort sharing regulation that is not part of this ETS. It is also the only major sector where emissions are still higher than in 1990. So that is really an area of concern. Buildings, we have a stagnation. Fossil heating remains dominant in many member states, very controversial in many member states. Agriculture, we have a modest reduction of emissions, but it is also very sensitive. We have a very strong lobby group here, and it is very directly related to everything related to nutrition, of course, right? So that is very sensitive to tell people where to buy food and how to produce food. And we have the forest carbon sinks, for example, that have been shrinking for a decade. When land use is changing, natural carbon sinks go away, but also, for example, when you cut down a forest, this also leads to, or especially when you have forest fires, this causes emissions. Well, we have seen a potential change since 2024. We're still waiting for the most recent data. The things are slightly changing, but these are really the sectors that are problematic. In contrast, the sectors that are subject to the ETS, so power, heavy industry, aviation, and the maritime sector are actually doing comparatively well. We have a member state compliance gap. Only 6 of 27 member states under the effort sharing regulation are actually on track with their national targets. And example of 2024, 17 member states exceeded their annual emissions limits. So we have an implementation or compliance problem. And if you consider, for example, experts, so not from the governments or the commission, but experts from NGOs, maybe you know of the Climate Action Tracker. They consider that the EU climate policies and action overall are insufficient to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target of the Paris Agreement. Of course, that is always up to discussion. As you know, there are very different political viewpoints on this. I simply want to show you the data and tell you, at least how the Commission considers their progress. And now we have discussed the successes, the problems, the legal framework. Let's now go into the second part of this talk, where I want to explain to you the most recent developments and which have prompted this provocative question of this lecture. I want to talk about legal setbacks and rollbacks in the last roughly 1.5 years, because there's actually a lot of things happening here, and I want to tell you about it. There is a political shift after 2024 in climate law. We have a new political landscape in Brussels after the most recent elections of the European Parliament in June 2024. Actually, Greens lost significantly, and we have especially a gain of votes and seats of the far right. And we have a new situation where actually the conservative political party is willing in certain situations to collaborate with the far right-wing parties in the European Parliament for certain initiatives. So to form majorities, political majorities in the European Parliament by including the far right, something that remains very controversial, as you may know, on the domestic level, whether to collaborate with far right-wing parties. This has already happened in the European Parliament. That is less in the spotlight of, I would say, of the media and the discussions. And actually, there have been majorities that have changed EU climate laws already. How did this develop? We have the very influential and important Draghi report. So Draghi, former Commission President, I think the central bank. And in September 2024, he issued a report which took stock of the EU's economic situation. And he raised the criticism that the EU's competitiveness internationally was at risk. So that basically explaining that we have a lot of crises, economic crises in many national economies, especially Germany, as you may know, has been in a recession for a couple of years now, is not competitive on an international level anymore, especially against companies from the US and China. And this is at least used by some political actors to justify regulatory rollbacks. I'm not saying that this report is wrong. This report raises very substantial issues, but of course, there's always the question, what do we make out of it, right? Well, in November 2024, we saw the Budapest Declaration, where EU leaders demanded a revolutionary simplification process. So simplification is the key political notion for the new approach to EU climate law. Simplification, again, especially pushed by also the new German government that has been in power now for roughly a year. And January 2025, another initiative, the Competitiveness Compass, reframing the green transition through industrial competition lens. So there is this new development that we need to strengthen our competitiveness, and that climate laws, of course, and that it's true, cause costs, right? It will lead to increased costs for the industries, for the first fossil fuel-based industries, not for the renewable industries, okay, but it produces costs, and that we need to prioritize the economy. First development. Second development, we have a significant change in the geopolitical situation. We have, of course, the traumatic full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation that is still going on today with severe political implications. We have a rollback of democracy and the rule of law in the US. We have a very sensitive, problematic relationship increasingly between EU member states and the US under the Trump administration, as you all know. We also have the increasing rise of China as an increasingly dominant superpower. So there is the sense that we need to strengthen our autonomy, our resilience against military threats especially, but also more broadly speaking, our economic resilience against external shocks, like, for example, right now in the aftermath or in the course of the US attacks against Iran and the energy price crisis that we've witnessed, so that we need to improve our resilience against these types of developments and, of course, to prepare for potential worst cases if we talk about potential wars in the future. So what I'm saying is there is a change of political priorities, and this, most commentators would say, goes to the detriment of climate policy. Okay? Again, I don't want to, take a political position on this. Yeah, right? I'm just describing what political scientists and economists have, basically have seen in the last years. From a legal point of view, these political programs do not automatically change law, right? They influence the legislative agenda, okay? So then we need to look from a legal perspective into what has actually changed, right? And that is what I want to do with you. What has changed, legally speaking? In February 2025, the Omnibus package was introduced. It's called Omnibus, and it's portrayed as a simplification package. Again, simplification is the key political notion, which insinuates that it's not about making things worse or weakening climate protection, but it's just to make things simpler and easier. That's what it seems to tell us, but it's actually not true. Actually, we have substantive changes, and we see that regulation for climate protection is being weakened. Okay. There were two main steps. So there are procedural delays. Things that turn up in climate protection will come later than expected, but we also have change in content. And let me give you a few examples. Remember the reporting directive on sustainability, where I told you companies need to upload reports on sustainability impact. It used to cover roughly 50,000 companies in the EU. Now it will only cover around 20% of the originally envisaged companies. And in addition, the reporting obligations were also reduced, right? And it was delayed. Due diligence, so about supply chain responsibilities. Also, again, the threshold is now that less companies will be subject to these obligations. Only very, very big companies with a yearly turnover of more than 1.5 billion euros. Supply chain obligations were reduced in scope, and especially there was an obligation included in this law for these companies to make a climate action plan. An obligation to plan ahead and to show how they would basically organize their company's activities to meet the climate neutrality goal of 2050. And this was completely deleted. This obligation doesn't exist anymore. Plus, this law was delayed, so it will only enter into force in a couple of years. For full transparency, these two laws had actually never been applied so far. So these entered into effect, but were supposed to, start at a later stage. And already before this stage was reached, they were already weakened. Okay. just for full transparency. And then finally, with the CBAM, the picture is a bit more complex. So about this carbon leakage tax at the border, there is an exemption if you import very low, well, comparatively low, below 50 tons of products per year, you're exempted. The idea is 90% of importers should be excluded while still covering 99% of the emissions. If that is true and will work, remains to be seen. This is actually now already in force. So companies already have for this year to start working on this with some, well, simplifications, actually simplifications in this case, but this is now in force, okay? And further rollbacks, combustion engine reversal. In 2023, a law was introduced that from 2035 onwards, only 100% zero emission cars, new cars, could be marketed in the EU. That was introduced in 2023. This was changed, especially by support of the German government, in December 2025. Now it's proposed, right? It's not already turned into law, but I'm quite sure it will. I think there's already a political agreement. Now only 90% of greenhouse gas reductions will be required in 2035, okay? The remaining 10% can be offset via low carbon steel or sustainable fuels in the production. So it's under the notion of technological neutrality, right? So it's supposed to not prohibited fuel combustion engines. It is supposed to make it possible for hybrids and range extenders to still be marketed in 2035. But there is actually already an initiative to further weaken this law. Furthermore, I haven't told you so far that the emissions trading system is supposed to be broadened. It is already a law that an emissions trading system 2 will be introduced that will cover road transport and building heating in the future. So that this very successful emissions trading system should be applied to other sectors as well, especially road transport, one of the, well, the most problematic one. And here so far, the rollback is only a delay from 2027 to 2028. It was delayed, implementation, but it's still on track to be implemented from 2028 onwards. And now maybe also to show you some arguments against a rollback, right? If you take the two instruments on the left side together, the idea is that in the future, road transport will be covered by the EU emissions trading system so that it will be automatically reduce the emissions by this trading system and the caps. So if that works well, there is actually no need for combustion engine prohibition because it would automatically come into reality because all of these certificates will get more and more expensive. And so the price will make sure that people will change to, for example, electric vehicles. So defenders of these reforms would say it's more consistent actually to not push too much for the 2035 phase out because we have already this bigger strategy of subjecting road transport to the emissions trading system too. Okay, that is something that people say to defend this. And there is, in my perspective, some truth to it as long as the ETS2 will be actually working effectively, okay? If that comes true, then we can see that, well, with the experience of the ETS1, it is a very efficient, well-working system. And then in best case scenario, maybe we do not need the 2035 phase out for fuel combustion cars, combustion engine cars, okay? So, well, if you go into the details, there are actually two sides of the story, okay? There are other rollbacks here, just to mention this, right? For example, for deforestation, there is a delay where you have stricter rules starting now December 2026 on imports in an environment that is influenced by deforestation. Common agricultural policy, also some rollbacks here. Overall, the pattern is we have competitiveness arguments here. We, of course, have lobbying, and we have a political shift rightward. And I'm just saying rightward, not necessarily right extremist direction, simply also conservative party increased in their shares in the election. So, of course, this will lead to a certain change in climate law as well. Part 3, let's look into the future. We have discussed the successes and the problems in the past. We've discussed the framework of EU law. We've discussed recent developments of changes and rollbacks. And now let's look into the future in the last 7 minutes. Well, as you know, climate change is a global problem. The EU must act as a global on a global level in order to actually make climate change mitigation real worldwide. There was the climate conference, the 30th in Belém, Brazil, last year, November. And here the EU submitted new nationally determined contributions, which is a legal term for international contribution to the world's global climate change mitigation efforts. And here we can see even an intermediate goal for 2035 was notified. It's even more ambitious than what we have so far. So the EU continues to push for an ambitious climate policy on a global level. And indeed, it is the first major economy with a legally binding 2040 intermediate target, even though this target is split up into 2 parts. So the 2040 target that I introduced to you in the beginning, where I said there is a certain caveat, here it is, 2040, 90% emissions reductions, but only 85% of the reductions must take place on EU territory. The other 5% can happen abroad as long as there is an international carbon credits program, which basically works that the EU finances certain certified projects abroad that can efficiently reduce emissions there. And then this will be attributed to the EU. So, for example, if you manage a very well organized project in Latin America to regrow a certain forest, then this will be a carbon sink that will be translated into carbon credits. And then this can be attributed to the EU if financed by the EU, so that it counts as if the EU had reduced their emissions themselves. And 5% of this 2040 target can happen with this international cooperation. Actually, a system that is also envisaged in the Paris Agreement itself, but which very much relies on the question whether these projects are actually administered in a fair and professional way, so that we can be actually sure that emissions reductions happen abroad and that it's not simply, for example, a fake project, right? As sometimes has already happened in the past. But there are actually some very good projects there that suffer from these black sheep that are basically cases of fraud, okay? Well, 90% with the caveat that 5% can be achieved abroad. And we have also other successes that the CBAM that I just introduced to you has already been introduced. And we have a first certificate price that is fairly high in the first quarter of 2026. So we can already see that it is influencing trading partners outside of the EU to strive for more climate-friendly technology. There's also the plan to expand this to more products in the future. So it's not only rollbacks, it's potentially that we can also see extensions in the future. And all in a very dire and problematic geopolitical context, also with regard to the climate policy, where the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement under the Trump administration as the second highest emitter worldwide. China is the highest emitter. So we have a pushback from the US against green policies, against climate policy. For President Trump, well, climate change is the biggest hoax that ever existed. The EU is actually trying to fill this leadership gap, so it has a positive role. But of course, these internal simplifications, right, of course, undermine the positioning internationally a bit, right? Where we can ask, well, is there maybe an increasing tension between green leader rhetorics and domestic deregulation? Overall, what remains legally binding are the targets that I introduced to you, the ETS with a tightening cap. There are further reforms expected. And so overall, especially if the ETS2 becomes operational, this is actually still can still be considered an ambitious climate law effort. And returning to the title, do we actually have a de facto end of the European Green Deal? Well, there are different ways of looking into it, right? So we have real progress. The ETS especially is working. We have decoupled economic growth from emissions, but also the rollbacks are real, right? CSRD, CSDDD, combustion engines, delays of important regulations, and all of this is not trivial. At the same time, the legal foundations, the framework still holds. The European climate law still holds. The targets remain binding, even if the 2040 target has received this caveat of 5% being achieved abroad. And so one way of thinking about it would be, and that is a question to you, if transformation is always linear, so can we perceive climate law and climate policy as a project that will progressively and linearly, go into a positive direction until we reach the perfect end state? Maybe sometimes you also have a curve, right? Maybe there's a political cycle with acceleration and reversals. And if we understand transformation as a nonlinear, sometimes even exponential project, maybe the picture is not so easy to evaluate. Consider, for example, the rate in which solar energy is currently growing worldwide. It's an exponential growth. Consider how battery technology is spreading worldwide. It's even growing more exponentially than solar energy. So there is also the potential for sudden change, not only in technology, but also in human behavior. And if you consider this from this nonlinear perspective, maybe the picture is a bit more complex than just to say, well, there's a rollback now and things are coming to an end. That is one possible way of seeing this. But of course, I know that this is a very controversial topic and you can have very different perspectives on this. And I'm very curious to hear about your opinions on this. And of course, to receive any questions or comments you may have. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now we can start the Q&A session. And if you have a question or a comment, please raise your hand and we come up with the mic that also the online participants can hear you online. Yeah.
If there is no question, perhaps a quick icebreaker question, because the ETS is one of the so-called, it's one of the what is functional. What happens if the companies don't have enough certificate for the ETS? Is there something they have to pay any tax or anything or any tickets?
Thank you for your question. So you're asking what happens if a company needs emissions but doesn't have any emission certificates anymore, right? So either you have to buy a certificate from a competitor. That is one potential way of doing it. You could go to the next auction. So auctions happen on a regular basis. So you simply go back and try to buy new ones that are not on the market just yet. That is another option. If you cannot achieve this, if you cannot buy another certificate, more certificates, then this means that you must stop with the emissions or you need to stop your production. So there is no way of continuing certificate anymore.
But if we are thinking in the future, and I think right now there are enough certificates that everybody can buy it or they have to buy it. But if you think in 10 years and there the amount gets smaller and there are no certificates, and do I have to stop by law my company, or if in this year if I can't buy any certificate, what says the law that what I have to do?
Yeah, no, great question. Thank you. So the idea would not be that you're being, there is prohibition for your company to continue working. The idea would be that if there are less certificates, these certificates will become more and more expensive. So theoretically, you could still buy an allowance. So you're, legally speaking, you're allowed to continue, but it will not be prudent to do so because there is no business case anymore. So the idea really is that the business case for companies that operate on a with fossil fuels or fossil resources will get worse and worse over time. And the idea is that there is this reduction of the cap successively, that there is a phasing out, right? That you have time to adapt because you already know, okay, it will become more expensive in the future. Let's try today to change our company's activities so that it will still be viable in the future. And so in a way, it's your risk as a company. If you continue your business model, you might run out of business in 10 years. Assuming that we remain strong and the ETS keeps on working. And there is, of course, the other potential development that these companies will continue their business model and start lobbying and asking for all types of reliefs or state aid or so on and so forth, which would undermine the system. Now, the idea is really it will become more and more expensive, so you should stop your business model if it relies on this. You should adapt.
Thank you very much. Is there another question?
Could you explain the price, how it evolves? So first, the carbon budget is capped, it's limited, and the price of the certificates are fixed in the beginning. How does the price is adapted? How does it rise?
Thank you. So indeed, there are some emissions trading systems which operate with fixed prices. So we have this, for example, in Germany for land transport sector, because the ETS 2 doesn't exist just yet. There we have a fixed price set by the government. In the EU ETS, we do not have a fixed price. We have an auction. So there is a certain amount of emissions, and then they are over the year introduced into these auctions. And then companies will bid, basically. And the more companies bid, the higher the price will rise because they need the allowance, and the one that has, the highest price will receive the emission certificates. So it is a market-based system that works on auctions. And this was the problem at the beginning because these certificates were too high in numbers, and so the auctions led to very low prices. So there is just a slight modification sometimes that more certificates are introduced into the yearly cap or taken away, depending on the market situation. But otherwise, it's simply based on auctioning.
But then it's not compatible. So the system for industry and the system, the national systems, for example, traffic or whatever, has not the same price.
So you're referring to systems outside of the EU, right? No, exactly. There is only within the EU and the ETS is operating. And for example, we have a system in California, an EU, emissions trading system in California in the US, still also under the Trump regulation, Trump administration. And they are not at all related. So these are two separate systems. And the idea is, or the EU is trying to link their emissions trading systems with other systems, and has, for example, achieved this with Switzerland. So Switzerland has an emissions trading system as a non-EU country, but it is linked with the EU ETS. Another example would be the UK. When it left the EU with the Brexit, it introduced its own emissions trading system that is not linked with the EU's. So that is a broader vision for the future to link it with like-minded states.
Then you have double, kind of double taxes. So one in the UK, and then you import them, and you again have to pay taxes. That's difficult, isn't it?
Absolutely. So there is a danger of double taxation, which is a danger we have in many areas of the economy, right? For example, with income taxes or so. We have it here, although most systems operate based on the seat of production. So usually what happens is, for example, with the UK, works similarly as the EU, you're only subject to it when you produce in the UK. And also in the EU, only when you produce in the EU, except for the CBAM, when you import, then, and you do not have any pricing, carbon pricing abroad, then you will be taxed. Okay, and for example, in this CBAM system, you will be relieved from the obligation to pay if in the country of production there is also a system in place. Okay, so that there is no double taxation.
Yeah, any other questions? Let's look in the chat. If you want to ask a question, just type in the chat, then we can read it and ask it. So for the online participant, option on this, no? Yeah, so maybe why was it not started completely uniform? Why not all in this first system, like for the industry? Why is it shifted or split it between partly national, partly EU-wide? Wouldn't it work to have a global market of carbon?
Okay, so why did we split it between different sectors, right? In the EU. So there are different answers to this. First answer is that subjecting companies to the ETS in a certain sector will, of course, increase costs. So the first question is, do you want a certain sector to face additional costs immediately, which is a political question. Then the second question is, which sectors do you want to compete for climate efficiency? Because all sectors included in the same ETS will compete in the auctioning. And then there could be the concern that it will become much more expensive for certain sectors that will be included that cannot in the same way reduce the emissions as quickly, for example. This is also why the EU ETS 1 and 2 will be separated. And thirdly, there's also sometimes a concern about the social costs, because especially areas like land transport and especially buildings and heating will lead to an increase of costs for persons that cannot really change anything. So, for example, tenants, when you rent an apartment, you will then face additional costs, but it's not your property, so you cannot change the heating system. It will be your landlord or landlady. So you're in this situation where, the very essential question where you can live and how much you pay for your living will be subject to increased costs without you having a direct influence on how to change the efficiency of your rented apartment. So you have to be very careful when you approach these sectors. Another factor is, for example, wind to power. It was really easy because there were only usually a handful of companies, producing coal energy, producing nuclear energy. So you had 10 big companies that you could talk to and negotiate this. Whereas when we're talking of buildings, you have tenants, landlords, so many companies. This is why we're now talking with the companies that produce the fuel and not with the landlords or landladies, for example. So when you look into these sectors, you face different regulatory challenges, political, economic, and social backgrounds that led to the decision of, step by step, introducing more and more sectors carefully into the system.
Other questions?
If not, one question. I think on page 7 or 8, you have shown us a look how we are going to reduce our emission to 2030. It's like 47 or 54%. Do you know any projections till 2050? How we going to be to net zero?
Not really, no. Sorry about that. I'm not aware of any data on this. I also don't think that we have projections that go that far. I think the farther we go, the more we rely on general yearly targets. So consider, for example, the 2040 target. It was just recently introduced because before we weren't even able to set a general target until that year. So I think they're just very general projections on the affordability and economic impact of these major goals, but there is no specific data comparable, to my knowledge, that we have for 2030, which is comparatively in the near future. Yeah.
I don't know any projection as well, so that's a question why, because it's also I think the farther we go, the harder it gets.
Exactly.
So, and if we are not on track right now, it'll be. I'm wondering how we do it, but well.
Exactly, because it gets harder and harder the more the farther we come. That is also one argument for which proponents of these 5% of the 90% target bring forward, right? So here these 5% international carbon credits, their supporters say, look, this is the problem. We're approaching the 90% target. It will get harder and harder. Why don't we try to achieve this abroad where it's still easier and attribute this to the EU, which could be more cost efficient?
Yeah, maybe not to end in such a pessimistic way. Maybe we can. Do you see any chance that it turns in the right direction? Maybe take it as a chance. The crisis as we have now, the Iran war, and the price getting down from solar, but not only solar, also wind, offshore wind power is getting down much cheaper. Do we see any chance that a fast turnaround will happen to get independent of oil and gas and to invest more in the cheaper and cheaper renewables? Do you see there's a chance?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. So actually, I'm fairly positive, I must say. Because for the fact that you're mentioning that we have an exponential growth of renewable energy technology, solar, wind, also batteries storage is very important. It's not that much in the media, I feel, but it's a revolution with the battery storage technology. there is being more and more produced, and it's getting more and more cheaper, right? And up to the point where we can see, well, in my perspective, that even laws that would contradict climate protection are actually not being applied because there is such a strong economic push towards green technology. We can see it in the US, for example. There is still the push for solar, there's still the push for wind, even though Trump really hates this technology. We see China as a huge player that, of course, is also building new coal mines, but is, producing more solar energy per year than all of the other countries combined actually have as a capacity. Sometimes, I think, roughly speaking. And so my understanding is that this economic revolution will happen anyway and will dramatically change the conditions for producing and using energy. And this, I think, will be unstoppable. And my prediction would be that the legal system would then react to this situation in a couple of years. So I'm actually fairly positive about this. It's just more the question, how can we streamline this? How can we make sure that there are no negative repercussions, that we don't have overly negative effects, for example, on the social situation of people, on biodiversity. So this is still a complex picture, but I think there is a very strong development, notwithstanding all the negative things we've discussed today. Yeah.
Yeah. Any question?
Thank you. And interesting because I think, are we only talking about the production of carbon? But if we think about personal aspects, like for example, people in America, how many carbon do they consume every year, and in China and different countries? Because I feel like we are talking about production, but like demand on how much carbons do we use for individual in each country every year, and this is my question.
For example, in Austria, it's about 10, 11 tons per person as an average. In other countries, maybe you know some.
So in the US, it's significantly higher. I don't know the exact figures right now, but I think it should be at least a third more than the Austrians. And in China, it's substantially less. And I think this is an excellent point that you're making, a very good question, because it allows us to look into the broader picture, right? So what you're basically, the underlying concept of your question is a question of climate justice and fair distribution of burdens involved with transformation of our energy systems. And we can still see that people living in the US and the EU, individuals, they will consume and produce significantly higher volumes of greenhouse gases per year than people living in other parts of the world, in China, but of course, especially in Africa and other, for example, in Latin America. So we have also different levels of economic development, where there are countries that rightly claim that they still want to develop further and achieve economic goals that the West, also the EU and the US, and of course countries like China have already achieved, which in many cases requires also emitting greenhouse gases, right? And so there is a very big problem. Well, it's the essential problem of international climate diplomacy. How do we distribute the burdens between countries? How much effort should China pursue? How much should be for the US, for the EU, and so on and so forth? And these countries cannot agree on a single formula to distribute the burdens. well, the US has completely left the stage, right? China is still very strongly supporting this. The EU very strongly supporting this. So I think it is very important to keep in mind when we discuss this. And this has been very much focused on the EU situation. But for example, when we look into criticism of the EU approach for the 1.5 target of the Paris Agreement, there are many people that criticize the EU for not being ambitious enough, exactly for the reason that individuals in the EU still produce much higher emissions than in other parts of the world, which would be a very strong argument to say, look, this is all great, but it's not enough.
This is the per capita system. So, for example, in Switzerland, there was developed this 1000 watt society. Each human may not consume more than 1000 watts as an average power. And this is ecologically suitable, not more. And then all people all over the world have the same right for power. And yeah, it works. It's technically possible to do so. Yeah, but it's a question of legal framework to put it into place. Yeah.
Maybe I can add, because I think that was also something you asked. Yes, the EU law on this is almost always focusing on the seat of production, right? So it will always look into the territory where a company is sitting and producing. And so, for example, imports from China to the EU, so products that were produced in China, the emissions caused there will not count as EU emissions. Also under the Paris Agreement, it doesn't generally count. It's a territorial distribution, which is problematic in its own, right? So you could criticize already this underlying basic idea. And I haven't talked about a judgment of the European Court of Human Rights from 2024 on climate change. There we have one passage, really. It's a side note by the court where it discusses the concept of embedded emissions, which would be the idea that a product carries its emissions from the production with it, and that the country that is importing these products would face some form of legal responsibility for emissions produced abroad at the seat of production, which would be a way of thinking differently about this, right? Could open the door to a concept that is not only focusing on where the production takes place, but it's still up for discussion.
Further questions? Doesn't seem so, and also not in the chat, I think. There's no more. Okay, so I would say thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming, and thank you to the online audience. And yeah, great. And we'll see, yeah, in 2 weeks for the campus keynote. You're welcome. Yeah, to the next lecture. See you again. Thank you.
Thank you. See you.